spores. Our second phylum is the Equisetophyta, which has also been called the Arthrophyta. That's in your lab manual. An even older name is Sphenophyta. For my purposes, let's just call it Equisetophyta because we've only got one living genus, which is Equisetum, which means horsetail. Equisetum is considered to be a living fossil because we see very similar looking plants throughout a lot of the fossil record without a lot of change. So very slow evolution, Brady-Teely, of this particular group of plants. They are recognized by having hollow ribbed stems. So we see the stems, they are hollow on the inside, and then on the outside they're kind of fluted or ribbed. And when you feel them, they kind of feel a bit almost like sandy because they are toughened with silica. At each node there are whorls of microphylls. And then if you see them at the right time, you'll find that they have collections of sporophylls, or spore-producing leaves. And the cluster is called a strobilus. And the strobili are made up of sporangiophores, and the sporangiophores are made up of sporophylls, which is where the spores are produced. And the spores in the Equisetophyta have specialized structures called elaters that help them to disperse the spores, and we've seen elaters before in the spores of liverworts. So here we can see our classic horsetail. You can see this up here. Those are the microphylls at each node. You can see the stem has these kind of lines on it that are the ribs. You can't see that it's hollow, but I assure you it is. And these are the strobili, where the spores are produced. And over here on this botanical illustration, you can see here's a strobilus, here's a sporangiophore, which is where the spores are produced. Our biggest extant phylum of seedless vascular plants is the Pteridophyta, also known as the Pterophyta. These are your true ferns, not horsetail ferns, not whisk ferns. True ferns are characterized by having megaphylls, and the megaphylls in ferns are called fronds. Usually they are pinnately compound, so they look kind of feather-like. That's what pinnately compound means, is that you've got a central stem with a lot of little leaflets on it arranged kind of like a feather. Ferns are also characterized by having circinate vernation. That means that as the new tissues grow and develop, they start off by being coiled up in a circular fashion or a spiral-like fashion. And as they grow, they unfurl, they uncoil. Kind of like if you have one of those birthday party blower toys and you blow into it and the curled up paper thing unfurls. That's kind of what circinate vernation is like. Ferns also have a special type of underground stem called a rhizome, which is where the roots are produced, and the fronds for that matter. Under the fertile fronds, you have clusters of sporangia, where the spores are produced, and that cluster of sporangia is called a sorus. Some ferns have an umbrella-like cover over their sori. It's called an indusium. And then each sporangium will open up to release the spores because of the straightening of a structure called an annulus. An annulus, it means little ring. And that little ring is around the outside of the sporangium. And when it conditions are right, moisture conditions are right, that annulus will straighten out, which will open up the spherical sporangium and release the spores. The gametophyte, which grows from the spores, start off, like in mosses, as a protonema, or a first thread. The protonemata will develop into a small, heart-shaped structure called a prothallus. And that prothallus is bisexual. It has both male gamete-producing structures, antheridia, and female gamete-producing structures called archegonia. And then the new baby fern that develops is called a sporling. So here you can see some circinate vernation. Here's the leaf or a frond of a fern that is early on in its development, and as it grows and develops, this will straighten out, and you would get to see the pinnately compound frond. Here you can see underneath this fertile frond, you have sori. These are the collections of sporangia, and you can see they're made up of what look like even smaller little dots. And those smaller little dots are the sporangia. There are some very large ferns, including tree ferns. These are some tree ferns at El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico. And here is the detailed life cycle of your fern in a generalized fashion. So here we've got a sporangium found within a sorus, and inside the sporangium is where meiosis is occurring. Meiosis is occurring within the diploid sporangium to produce the haploid spores. The annulus around the outside of the sporangium will straighten to allow the spores to be dispersed, released. The spores can then grow into a protonema and then into a young gametophyte. And here is your prothallus, which has rhizoids to anchor it to the surface. And you've got antheridia around the outside of this heart-shaped thing, around the edge. And then right here in the cleft, you've got the archegonia, where the female gametes are produced. So they still rely on water to move the sperm to the egg and achieve the zygote through fertilization, which is something that happens less and less frequently in more derived lineages of plants. So on these prothallus, on this bisexual gametophyte, the zygote is produced, and the new sporophyte may start to grow and develop. Here's our sporling, and as this gets bigger and bigger, the gametophyte gets dwarfed by the new sporophyte and eventually just sort of withers away. So now we've got a new sporophyte. Here's its rhizome with its adventitious roots. Here is the young leaf, which is going to expand through circinate vernation. And here we've got a fertile frond, which kind of looks like a feather because it's pinnately compound, with these little dots under here, which are the sori. The sori are clusters of sporangia. That gets us back to our sporangium here. All right, our final phylum of the seedless vascular plants is the Phylum Lycophyta. Lycophyta has several different common names, many of which don't really describe its evolutionary history. So we call them club mosses, but they're not mosses. We call them ground pine because they kind of look like small pine trees, but they are not related to pines. Resurrection plant, because there is a species which is very well adapted to being completely dried out, desiccated. Just add water and it'll spring back to life. There are also some members of Lycophyta called quillworts because they look like writing quills. But the phylum Lycophyta, all members have microphylls with only one strand of vascular tissue. They also, like Equisetum, have strobili, or clusters of sporophylls. But an interesting thing we see in the Lycophyta is that there are some homosporous members and some heterosporous members. So ferns are homosporous, Equisetum is homosporous, Psilotum is homosporous. In the Lycophyta, we see some members that are homosporous and some that have two sizes of spores or are heterosporous. So here you can see maybe why someone might think this looks like a pine. It's got little scale-like microphyll leaves. Here you can see a bunch of strobili, which kind of look superficially like pollen cones on a pine tree, but they're not. And then in the ancient past, even though they are a lineage that has microphyllous leaves, there used to be a lot of very large members of Lycophyta growing all over. So in the age before the dinosaurs, there were lycophyte trees during what's called the Carboniferous period. And the Carboniferous period is when most of our coal deposits were laid down. And the coal deposits are the fossilized remains of very large lycophytes and equisetophytes. And here's just one example of an artist's representation of an ancient lycophyte. So our next great leap forward will be the advent of seeds.